So very good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to this SHM webinar in partnership of Khitan and Company. This on interface between GST and criminal laws, key practical learnings. We have with us Mr. J.K. Mittal, who is a co-chairman of SHM National Council on Indirect Taxes. Apart from him, we are also joined by two eminent experts, Mr. Sudipta Bhattacharjee, partner of Indirect Taxes, Khitan and Company, and Mr. Rajiv Bhatnagar, partner law related to white collar crimes, Khitan and Company. So I would like to invite Shri J.K. Mittal to deliver the welcome address for this session.
Thank you, Mr. Vinash. Good afternoon to all of you. Today's, the discussion is on the very, very important topic. And I'm sure Mr. Sudip Bhattacharya and Mr. Rajiv Bhatnagar will take the discussion forward. But before, my friends start the discussion, I just would like to make certain remarks so that my friends can, take into account those factors also, which I'm sure would be in their mind. We have seen since the GST was introduced, there are certain, activity has taken place throughout the country, which has given either the bad name to the GST or bad name to the taxpayers. Almost every day we hear the news, the GST officer arrest, the taxpayers and the chartered accountants. And the allegations are quite, disturbing, saying that there is a certain bills have been exchanged without the supply of goods or services. And now the things has gone beyond that, stating that even the professionals are, abating such kind of crimes. So therefore, the first question is that what exactly is the crime? What has been stated in the law, and whether the moot question, which recently has come up in the discussion in the Kolkata also, and that if there is no supply of goods at all, whether that activity fall within even the ambit of the GST law at all. And while doing so, the department has the different set of practices. And that practices is that they record the statement of people, various people on the spot. And now the question arises, what is the law regarding recording of the statement by the officers? And the section 70 is very small, maybe of 3 or 4 lines, but it has very inbuilt safeguard. Whether that safeguard are being followed by the officers, because before issuing any summon, they have to record the reason why the person is required to be summoned. Secondly, the summon only can be issued by the proper officer, not by every officer. Who is the proper officer here? And moot question is that when the search are being conducted on the allegation of the certain crime has been committed by the certain peoples, on the spot, not only the statements are recorded, but also certain recoveries also made. Whether that recovery could be made, which is the law, whether the Indian Penal Code or the CRPC or the GST law permit to do so. If not, why no actions are being taken by the government against those very officers? And as well as if the summons are being issued, whether it can be issued indiscriminately, asking everybody to appear one by one, how many times, what is the way out when the persons are being called in their own office at the midnight and they are kept in confinement for throughout the night on the name of the recording of statement. When the law permit do so, what kind of measures could be taken by the assessee to safeguard themselves in this regard? The next important question is that when the seizures are being made, and the seizures could be made in which way, that would be very important. Recently I was going through the certain judgments, what the High Court and Supreme Court said. Section 165 of the CRPC is squarely applicable to the search made in the taxation law as well. And in fact, the GST, if we see, section 67 subsection 10 squarely said that the provision of the CRPC would be equally applicable to the search and seizure conducted under the GST law. Therefore, whether the officers are complying with those situations, I just want to say, with my experience, a very recent example, one of the chartered accountant in Faridabad, his premises, both office and house, were searched. And the officer took away not only the voluminous documents, but his personal mobile phone and laptop also. And just they took away, and in the court, they are taking a plea that, yes, we have taken away, no seizure is made. We have not seized it. We just take away. Which is the law? How they take it away? What really the law says? What could be the remedy before the assessee? Because I know large number of cases. Every officer, and I say on record at many platforms that every officer has made it a draconian law, as Justice Chandrachud recently said while hearing one petition in the April, that the GST law was made with a good intent by the parliament, but enforcement agency has made it as a draconian law. Therefore, the search and seizure, particularly the seizure, what is the law? Who can seize it? What procedure should have been adopted to have a valid seizure? If it is not a valid seizure, what recourse are available to the assessee in this regard? Because otherwise the trial will go on, the proceeding will go on for next 10 to 15 years. By the time the assessee will close down in business because he will be harassed too much. These are the important points. In addition to that, which is the most, I think, the core point, I'm sure Mr. Sudipta and Mr. Bhatnagar would cover it. What is the real procedure? We all know the Gujarat High Court in one of the judgment last year said no FIR is required to be registered, no SOCOS notice is required to be issued before making an arrest, before taking certain proceedings. But I know what is the government stand. Government said if a person is arrested today under GST law and is put behind the bar, he may be granted a default bail after 60 days. But no criminal proceeding is initiated till now. Criminal proceeding shall deem to be initiated only when a formal complaint is filed under section 190 and 200 of CRPC by the government officer. This, to my mind, in 95 to 99% cases never been filed by the government department. I personally filed 3-4 years back one RTI by asking to the government in last 5 years how many persons have been arrested throughout the country on the alleged evasion of excise duty and service tax or GST, and in how many cases you actually filed a complaint before the magistrate so that he can be convicted or he may get scot-free. They said we don't have any data at all. How government can function if they don't have any data? That means they are hiding it. Because if the public data will be revealed to say that 100 people are arrested in one particular year and complaint was never filed against them in their lifetime, so then what actually happened? They are remain on bail till they die, and they never be convicted or never be get the scot-free because no criminal proceeding is initiated. So therefore, if you consider one of the Adani Enterprises judgment of the Bombay High Court, where the High Court has recently concluded that the provision of section 154, 155, 157 will be applicable to the criminal proceeding initiated under the Custom Act, which we have the similar provision now under the GST law. Therefore, these would be the important factor so that the person under the threat of the arrest is, because what is happening in the real, if you see, I'm sure you knows it, but if the benefit of the everyone, if we can touch upon those issues, which we will take up later in the question answer also, if if the police make an arrest, then what would happen? They will ask, even a CBI make arrest or a DRI make arrest or the PMLA make an authority make an arrest, they ask the custodial interrogation. They have the certain premises where they keep, these arrested people. But in the GST, you see, None of the person throughout the country, or even the Central Excise Law 1944 till now, not even a single case they ask for custodial interrogation of even for a single minute. They simply move an application for the judicial remand of the arrested person. That means his presence is not required by the officer at all. He just arresting. So next point which I want to give it for your thought and to touch upon it, that if you keep in mind the Arnesh Kumar judgment, if you keep in mind the CRPC provisions, if the ultimate conviction happens and the total punishment, maximum punishment prescribed is less than 7 years, whether the arrest can ever be made, what really the law to make an arrest? Therefore, what case can be made out so that every attendee should know it today, if these arrests are being made illegally, and you have a lot of legal recourse so that maybe Mr. Sudipta, Mr. Bhatnagar, or maybe me had lot of business also to get the relief for all such people, that if arrests are being made for less than 7 year total punishment, the law says no arrest shall be made unless until the IO should record the reason in writing why arrest is required to be made. I know large number of people, including many big companies, told me we are cooperating. In every summons we are appearing, still he is arresting people. So what is this fun? Arrest cannot be made on whims and fancies. If you remember the so many judgment of the Supreme Court, the liberty of the person is most important. Arrest is only on those cases where the officer is able to prove that if he remain out, he will influence the evidence, like this. But the most of the cases, in such kind of cases, the GST cases which I know, the many judges said these are the record-based transaction. In record-based transaction, you can't fudge anything. You can't. It is not like a criminal law where a murder has been committed, he will remove certain evidence. Like these are the record-based transaction. And they themselves said, in every arrest, they themselves said, these persons have supplied the goods, these are the bills, these are the things, no goods is supplied. If these are the record-based evidence, what is the need of arrest? So therefore, we should dwell upon that. What is really the criminal law, so that we can have a better interplay between the GST and the criminal law. What really the procedure one should follow it. And these are the, I think it would be the very, very important issue to cover up into today's discussion, so that everybody should know it, what is the legal right they have it. One more important factor, because I still have the 3-4 minutes, I should think, I'm thinking to cover my 15 minutes time, and so that you have the full time to dwell upon it. The one important factor from the assessee perspective, I'm not speaking as an advocate, I'm accumulated, all the thoughts which come in the mind of the all assessees, which they put the questions to the lawyers and they want a relief on that point. They said, can I, take, the advocate along with me when my interrogation is being made? What is really the law about it? What the court said, and why the lawyers are not being allowed, when the lawyers are being allowed? This is second point is that the one important question they ask, our statements are being recorded, why the copies are not being provided to us? Even sometimes the Panchanama copy is not given. Sometimes the search are being made. No independent witness are being called. What is the law regarding that? They carry, the witnesses from the different part of the country. And the law says it should be from the locality only. And secondly, once the witnesses are, recorded, they said it is 20-year-old, 18-year-old, 21-year-old. He doesn't know any language. He just put his signature. What is the sanctity of having witness then? Whether, such kind of funny things is happening. So why we should have a law like that? There should be witness. No witness is required then. And another important factor, once the statement are being recorded, they ask n number of questions. Like, for example, are you liable to pay GST? Are you liable to get an exemption? Like last year, if you can see, many arrests were being made on the saying that whether the sanitizer, what should be the rate of tax? And they said you are evading the tax, arrest has been made. if there is a dispute about the classification, whether it is a X percentage or Y percentage tax applicable, whether the law permit to arrest some people, what kind of this law is there, whether the law is being implemented wrongly or whether there is a deficiency in the law. And the last point you may please touch upon, otherwise we will see at the time of question answer. Last year ASSOCHAM participated in the meeting where the ministry constituted a committee saying that we want to decriminalization of the GST law, decriminalization, which already happened in the corporate law only. So what happened to that meeting? If the government thought about it, एक बच्चा जो अभी 4 साल का हुआ है और उसके 4 साल में ही पूत के पालने में पहचाने जाते हैं, कहते हैं, तो पता चला कि ये क्रिमिनल लॉ बनाया ही गलत है, इसके अंदर उन्होंने हटाने की प्रक्रिया भी शुरू की कमेटी ने। वो कौन ऐसे लोग हैं, vested interest, who are those people, those who do not want a decriminalization of this law? Because to my mind, this thought process would have come in the government when this process would have been extremely cumbersome or you may say extremely unbeneficial to the taxpayer and abuse of power by the officer by corrupt practices. The government would have thought about it. So this with I end and give my back to the Avinash to take it forward, and I will come back once the question answer session comes. Thank you so much for both my speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your very informative address, and you have laid the foundation, and I hope Mr. Sugipta and Mr. Rajiv Bhatnagar will take it forward. So I would request Mr. Sugipta to carry on his presentation, and after both of their presentation, we can have the question answers. So I would request all the attendees to keep posting your question in the question answer box, which will be answered by our experts. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Avinash, and very good afternoon to everyone who have logged in. We are having a very potent GST Council meeting also going on. So I mean, still you have logged in to hear us. So it's quite flattering, and thank you for that. We are discussing a very critical issue, a very important issue, interface between GST and criminal laws. And as Mr. Mittal clarified, there are far too many interfaces, unfortunately, that we are coming across these days. So it is important that we are aware of our rights and liabilities and best practices, if any. The topics that we will cover today are obviously I'll start with some context setting in terms of the key areas of interface. We will touch upon summons and recording of statements. We will talk about inspection, search and seizure. And then we will end with one of the most critical topics, which is preventive arrests under GST, bail, different types of bail, and various defenses, key aspects around that. In terms of backdrop, like Mittal have said, unlike service tax, where the law was allowed to mature for a fairly long time before criminal prosecution was introduced, under GST, unfortunately, we have started off with preventive arrests, and not only preventive arrests, there are a wide range of very strong powers that have been given to the department, which unfortunately are being misused quite frequently. Also, GST law, when it comes to prosecutions, presume a culpable mental state, i.e. mens rea, or intention to evade, when it comes to GST prosecution. And unfortunately, there have been quite a few High Court judgments which say that assessment or adjudication need not be completed for invocation of preventive arrests under Section 69. Mr. Mittal touched upon decriminalization of GST laws. Unfortunately, despite our repeated representations, it does not seem possible in the foreseeable future. It does not seem to be in the horizon. Constitutional challenges have been made before various high courts, which have not succeeded. Now the matter is pending before the Supreme Court also. There is no doubt that tax evaders must be taken to task, but the collateral damage, the cost of that collateral damage vis-a-vis honest taxpayers who are getting caught in the crossfire is unfortunately proving to be rather too high. In GST, there is a saying, and I read this line somewhere, suppliers sin and recipients repent. A lot of the times, the problems, the non-compliances, the breaches that get alleged against us are because of someone else's act or omission, and which also makes it very, very critical to understand the risks and review a lot of our business processes. Because one thing is to contest as and when a demand comes up and exposure arises, the other thing is to be proactive and strengthen our defenses so that we are better prepared to deal with any such eventuality. And of course, one of the things that Mr. Tilagin touched upon is that offenses under GST are also, when department is also triggering FIRs under Indian Penal Code for offense for some of the offenses under GST. So that exposure of prosecution not only under GST law but also under IPC makes it all the worse in terms of the seriousness of exposure whenever GST and criminal laws interferes. When does preventive arrest provisions trigger under GST? I think this is one of the methods. I've also spent quite a bit of time talking about the risk and the threat of preventive arrests. When does it trigger under GST? It triggers under Section 69, and these are the, Section 69 says a lot of things, talks about cognizable, non-cognizable. Some of those aspects Rajiv will deal with, but purely from a GST perspective, these are the 4 or 5 triggers that's there in terms of invocation of Section 69. One is commits or causes to commit and retain the benefit arising out of supply of goods or services without invoice in violation of GST laws with intent to evade tax. The second one is a reverse of this, issuance of invoice without any supply. The third is availment of input credit using an invoice mentioned above, or fraudulent availment of ITC without any invoice. And I'll come to the fourth a little later. So if you see the first 3 triggers, seemingly very serious offenses, but I'll tell you how these can get triggered even for compliant companies in much more honest, innocuous sort of scenarios. Let's start with supply of goods or services without invoice. Think of a scenario where there is a company with multiple branches across India. The chief technical officer or the chief financial officer is sitting out of Bombay, and there's a Delhi branch also, but say that Bombay is not raising a support service invoice on Delhi. GST authorities might tomorrow say that the CTO or the CFO is providing financial or technical support services. Because the CTO or CFO is in Bombay, Bombay registration is providing technical or financial support services to Delhi, and by not raising invoices, cross-charge invoices for that, you are triggering the first condition. You're triggering the first condition under Section 69, especially if the company in question is in a business which is outside, where the credit is not available. Secondly, issuance of invoice without any supply. Again, take the same example of a multi-branch business in India. And in this example, say, okay, one of the typical things that companies do when there is accumulation of input credit in a particular location, one of the things for liquidation of that credit is cross-charging. So you raise a cross-charge for maybe support services, maybe some other kind of services being rendered from that location to another location, and you liquidate the ITC sitting there. There are questions being raised in audits and investigations by DGGI where they are saying that prove that there was a service. Is there a substance in your claim of service? What exactly was the nature of the service provided? What was the service provided? Does the providing location have the men, material, and resources to provide such a service? Once the substance of that transaction that cross-charge invoice gets called into question, in order to increase the pressure, in order to increase the degree of coercion, the second trigger is being invoked, which is issuance of invoice without any supply. There are cases where DGGI is saying that if the cross charge seems like a transaction without substance, it essentially is an issuance of invoice without any supply, in which case we will trigger this, and they are threatening preventive arrest under Section 69. Similarly, if we come to the last trigger that we had left out, which is collection of any amount as tax but not depositing it beyond a period of 3 months. Again, seems like a very serious and a straightforward sort of trigger. But I'll tell you where this is being invoked against honest taxpayers. Say you enter into a contract which says the contract price is ₹100 inclusive of all taxes. You have factored in an exemption. You know that these services or these supplies are exempt from GST. But maybe there is a dispute that crops up at a later date. Department is saying that since your contract price clause stated ₹100 inclusive of all taxes, you did envisage certain amount of taxation. And you have actually that 100 rupees is inclusive of the GST amount of 18 or 12 or whatever the case may be, and you have collected it from the customer and not deposited it, and hence we will invoke this particular provision against you and arrest you preventively. So this is how even in innocuous honest taxpayers cases also some of these provisions have been triggered, and it's not too far-fetched if you think about it. You all of us know about ITC blockages under Rule 86A. Rule 86A also uses very similar words, reason to believe that ITC is being availed fraudulently, very similar to the triggers that we have discussed above. So if two-way 3B reconciliation or mismatch leads to a reason to believe in the nature that we just discussed, it is quite possible, and department, it's just a short leap from here to invoke preventive arrest under section 69 for the department, which is why it is extremely critical for us to understand the key interfaces between criminal law and GST. And to that end, let's start with one of the specific areas, which is summons. Now, summons, Mittal Saab also covered a fair bit in his piece, and he has been a pioneer in challenging summons or arbitrary exercise of power to summons. Let's look at the section. It's a very small section. It starts with proper officer under this act shall have power to summon any person to give evidence or to produce a document, etc., in any inquiry in the same manner as provided in case of a civil court, etc., and that such inquiry shall be deemed to be a judicial proceeding. There are multiple filters in this. It is a wide power, but the law itself provides multiple filters. Proper officers. All of us are aware of the canon decision of the Supreme Court, where long pending litigation was quashed on account of the fact that the investigation was, the show cause notice was issued by someone who is not the proper officer. While that was in the context of customs, the findings in canon and many other decisions before that apply squarely in the context of GST. We need to, moment we get a summons, we need to see, is this issued by the right authority? Is this issued by the proper officer under GST law? If it is issued by an authority other than that, that itself can be a ground to challenge a summons. Then it says shall have the power to summon any person. Yes, the statute says power to summon any person, but the fundamental principle under that has emerged under Indian constitutional law over the last 70-75 years is that all such powers have to be exercised in a manner that is not arbitrary, in a manner that is reasonable, judicious, etc. So there are circulars and there are instructions from the department from as long back as 1989, where they have clarified that, calling or summoning someone very senior in the company, a CFO, CEO, a tax head, etc., should be a matter of last resort, should be done only when all other options fail. You cannot call someone at odd hours. It has to be within reasonable official hours. These are all guidelines which have been laid down and reiterated again and again by the department itself in multiple circulars, etc. Yet, yes, as Mittal Saab pointed out, they are being flouted as we speak. All of us have experienced that. But the point is, these are the guidelines, or these are the shields that we have to fight against all such arbitrary exercise of power. If you look at some of the key, if we look at some of the key legal aspects in terms of, I think we have covered the first point, who all can be summoned. The instructions that I have mentioned here can be referred. One is from 1989, another is a little more recent, but they've very clearly laid down how it is only as a last resort a senior officer can be summoned. Interrogation at odd hours is not permitted. It has to be reasonable within the working day, within normal working hours. Parallel summons by central and state investigating officers is another menace that many of us are dealing with. And this is something that many of us had foreseen when cross-empowerment had happened. I think the underlying principle against any such parallel summons is mutual exclusivity of the subject matter. So as long as we are able to establish that both the summons from the center and the state authorities pertain to the same transaction, same aspect, same issue, one can easily contest a parallel summons, which is why if you see a lot of the litigation on this issue in the last 1 year or 1.5 years revolves around the fact as to whether the issue or the aspect in question under both the summons are the same. Department keeps trying to establish that no, that's a different one. This is the difference. We're looking at it from maybe this angle, or we're looking at this particular aspect of the transaction. So the underlying premise that only one authority can exercise jurisdiction is no longer being questioned, thankfully, by the department. They are trying to do it in a roundabout way by establishing that the subject matter is different. So I think the moment summons come, I mean, we are in a scenario where parallel summons have been received. It is imperative that we review very carefully and try and ascertain whether the subject matter of both are broadly similar. If it is the repeat summons, I mean, the second summons can definitely be successfully challenged in a high court. The next point is, are repeat summons questionable? I mean, not per se, not automatically. The department has the right to summon you more than once. But again, the test of reasonableness, the test of non-arbitrariness is equally applicable here. If summons as a power, as a tool, is weaponized to harass SSC, to coerce SSC, that can be challenged in any high court. Arbitrary exercise of power can be challenged in any high court. I mean, we have seen many examples of successful challenges to summons. So yes, repeat summons, if bordering on harassment, if amounting to harassment, can definitely be challenged. But per se, they are not illegal. Consequences of non-compliance with summons can be quite serious. There can be imprisonments up to 6 months, fine. There will be consequences even for furnishing false evidence. But having said that, practically speaking, if a summons is being issued on a very short notice, and that also happens, they will give you a 48-hour notice and ask you to appear in a different city. It is reasonable and it is within law, within your rights under law, to ask for short extensions, maybe on account of inconvenience or short notice or documents not being available, etc. Typically, extensions of this nature do get granted. If they get rejected, if requests for extensions do get rejected, then of course the case to prove arbitrariness of the departmental action can be built up. Similarly, even during the process of summons, if you don't have the relevant answer, the facts or information, it is okay to seek time instead of making a false or a wrong statement. Because as I said, the proceedings in summons are akin to judicial proceedings. And what is the import of that, I will come to in the next slide. But it is very important that you make the right point, error-free, in the correct manner, without giving any sort of misimpression. Because and you can seek time if you are not confident. You can come back again, but do not try to avoid giving any sort of erroneous data, information, document, etc. And last but not the least, it's an obvious point. If the GST officers during a summon proceeding are threatening you again and again, coercing you with preventive arrest, it is a good idea to explore anticipatory bail, filing for an anticipatory bail. What are the scenarios in which that can be sought? We will cover later. Now coming to the point about judicial proceedings. I mentioned that because it's judicial proceedings, so what impact does it have? Because these have been deemed to be judicial proceedings. Unlike many of you know that a statement that we make before a police officer in a thana is not admissible as evidence in court, right? But that is not the case about the statements we make before a tax officer under a summons proceeding. We have a specific section, section 136 under the CGST Act, which deals with the relevancy of statements. What it says is it prescribes two scenarios where a statement made under summons under section 70 shall be admissible and shall be considered as a relevant evidence by the court. What are the two scenarios? I'll start with B first. When the person who made the statement is examined as a witness in the case before the court, and the court is of the opinion that having regard to the circumstances of the case, the statement should be admitted in evidence in the interest of justice. Two things come out very categorically. In order to admit evidence that is emanating from a statement recorded under summons, the person who made the statement should be examined as a witness. And that examination, of course, will include cross-examination by the SSC against whom the prosecution is being conducted. So this right to cross-examine a witness based on whose statement I am being prosecuted is a very, very important right, and we must not lose sight of this right if a prosecution is being launched against me or any of my client. So this right to be because the other scenario is covered under A, which when the person who has made the statement is dead or cannot be found, or basically if the person who made the statement is not present before the court of law or cannot be present before the court of law, then the court of law will go by the summons, go by the statement as recorded in the summons. It will not look at anything else. Hence, it is very, very critical that A, we ensure that we get a right to cross-examine the particular witness and try and poke holes in his narrative, failing which we have to live with the with that particular statement as it exists. We may not be able to do anything much about it. We'll have to find other evidence to counter any evidence that has emerged from the from that particular statement, which brings us to the point about retraction of statements. Often when we are summoned, there is a lot of coercion, there is a lot of implied threat, if not a direct threat of violence, and that may push us, that may force us to make statements which we don't want to, which is okay. The law allows you to retract that statement, but for heaven's sake, make sure you retract it as soon as possible. One must, after recording of statements, do a debrief very quickly, jot down everything that one remembers. We can ask for a copy of the statement. It is our right to see a copy of that statement, but often it is not provided, and you can go to court to implement that, but that's a long drawn process. From a business process perspective, it may be a good idea to do a debrief immediately when things are fresh in your mind and identify that, okay, these are the 2 or 3 things that I might need to be retracted, that might incriminate me, and they're not even true, and they're not even presenting the whole wide picture. And in that case, the retraction has to happen quickly, within 4 or 5 days, or maybe a little more, but definitely before a statement, before a show cause notice gets issued. Once a show cause notice gets issued and you try to retract, it is of very little value. Such retraction is of very little value. So retraction of a statement that is recorded on a timely manner, I cannot emphasize the importance of that enough. Often cases are won and lost because we fail to retract in time. I think we have covered many of these aspects, so we can move on to the next topic, which is inspection, search, and seizure. The sources of law are section 67 of the CGST Act, read with 139 to 141 of the rules. And as Mittal have said, 6710 specifically borrows the Code of Criminal Proceedings in the context of search and seizure under GST. Mind you, only for search and seizure, not for inspection. Magistrate, wherever CRPC uses the word magistrate, we have to read commissioner under GST. And a lot of the safeguards that Mr. Mittal was alluding to vis-a-vis search and seizure, they don't come from the GST law, they flow from the CRPC, which includes your right to have your witnesses, independent witnesses from the beginning to the end of the search, who will sort of effectively certify that the search was kosher, that the due process was followed. The various other guidelines, and I'll come to them in a bit. All of that flows from CRPC or jurisprudence under CRPC. Inspection, as the government FAQ says, is a softer provision than search. Enables officers access to a place of business of a taxable person or a transporter or a warehouse keeper. Search, on the other hand, is a much more intrusive action. The government machinery officers can go look through, overturn things, examine a place carefully, a person, an area, an object, in order to find something secreted in any place. These are the words used, secreted in any place. And we'll come to the interpretation of secreted in any place. Clearly, these affect fundamental rights, our right to privacy, our right to live peacefully, and which is why these can be done. The filters that the statute provides, the protection that the statute provides is these can only be done upon an authorization from the proper officer, not below the rank of Joint Commissioner, having reasons to believe. I'll come to reasons to believe because that's a topic on its own. Proper officer, once again, canon and multiple decisions before that, very, very critical to see which officer is issuing the summons. Does he have the power to issue the summons? Does, on the basis of canon, one can even challenge DGGI's power to issue summons, DGGI's power to issue search warrants. And there are solid arguments. Many of these arguments are being raised as we speak. So do not automatically assume that if it has come from a joint commissioner, it is a proper officer, and we don't need to look further. There may be merit in looking into how that particular officer has been empowered under GST law to qualify as a proper officer. Now, coming to when these provisions might get triggered, for inspection, search and seizure. For inspection, when a taxable person has suppressed supply transactions, if there is a reason to believe that a taxable person has suppressed supply transactions or engaged in transport or storage of goods which have escaped payment of tax, then inspection can trigger. 67(2) pertains to search and seizure, which is more pertinent to our topic. And that is, as Mithil said, pari materia to section 105 of Customs Act. So a lot of that jurisprudence that have evolved for the last 50-60 years under Customs Act are squarely applicable in the context of search and seizure under GST. It is always important when fighting a litigation for challenging a search seizure under GST to look at jurisprudence under Customs Act. What are the triggers for search and seizure? Any goods liable to confiscation or documents or books or things which in the proper officer's opinion shall be useful for or relevant to any proceedings under this act are secreted in any place. If these conditions are satisfied, or there is the officer has a reason to believe that these conditions have been satisfied, then a search and seizure can be authorized and carried out. Now, if you look at the first part, let's talk about a couple of words that are of importance. Books or things. If you say, what is the ambit of things? Obviously, books have been covered separately, documents have been covered separately. Things is obviously of a very wide ambit, and it can include your IT assets also. I mean, this is a connected question that I often get asked. Can I refuse giving the password to my laptop, to my mobile? The answer, unfortunately, as on date, is no, because there is an adverse Karnataka High Court judgment specifically to that effect. But as right to privacy has been recognized by the Supreme Court, and as more and more litigation happens by testing right to privacy against many of these draconian powers that the government has, I guess that answer might be relooked at. I'm not saying the answer will change, but maybe more safeguards will be prescribed in the coming days. Also, when IT assets are, remember, when seizure happens, the goods, documents that are seized are to be given back. I mean, they can be kept to the department only till the time that is necessary. Of course, that is slightly open-ended, but there are tests of reasonableness. If it's an IT asset, department is free to get it cloned and give back the original. They need the data in that asset. They don't need the asset per se, right? So they can get it cloned, and many officers are doing that. In fact, I mean, as recently as day before yesterday, we had a scenario where a customs raid happened at one of my clients, and they cloned all laptops and mobiles, but they gave back. They didn't seize those particular assets, which I think is a more reasonable thing to do in a seizure procedure. So vis-a-vis IT assets, that's something that one can ask for. Also, one thing that is different in summons, there was a word in any inquiry. So department can summon a person when an inquiry is already in place, when an investigation is already happening. That is not required vis-a-vis search, because the words used vis-a-vis the search triggers are a little bit wider. It says useful or relevant to any proceedings under the Act. So there doesn't need to be an existing inquiry. And also, what is the meaning of secreted in any place? Supreme Court interpreted in Gyanchand's case as early as 1961. Documents which are not kept in their usual place, or documents or things which a person is likely to keep out of the way or put in a place where the officer cannot find it. That's how secreted means. So it's a fairly wide definition. It doesn't, department doesn't need to prove actual secrecy of the documents seized or the items or things seized. Secretive is being interpreted in a fairly loose, liberal sort of manner. Now, coming to reason to believe, of course, one of the very critical sort of filters or protections. Reason to believe has to be different from reason to suspect. It is have to be a good faith thing based on relevant materials. Because as we understand, I mean, the two English words, suspect and belief, they're different, right? You need belief is higher than suspect. The threshold for belief has to be higher than suspicion, which is why reason to believe has to be higher than a reason for mere suspicion. One has to really apply, the officer who is forming that reason to believe has to have independent reasoning, application of mind before it he arrives at that reason to believe. The GST law does not mandate recording of that reason to believe, unlike CRPC or under Income Tax Act. But through case laws, it has been interpreted in the context of customs that the officer should record, and I think those provisions will apply equally in the context of GST as well. Now, bear in mind that authority must have sufficient material to form reason to believe. There has to be specificity to that. A roving inquiry, a fishing expedition as we call it, is not permitted. ऐसा नहीं कि रेड करने चले गए, देखते हैं सर्च में क्या मिलता है. That is not permissible. The officers must know broadly what we are looking for, what they are looking for. What is the nature of the object or nature of the information that they're looking for? It cannot be an open-ended, generic, roving inquiry. It has to be specific. So overall, judicial review of reasons to believe is possible, and believe you me, this is one of the most important areas whenever we are challenging a search or a seizure. This is one of the first things that we look at if we are able to attack reasons to believe. Mostly we are home, and it is very common because often search seizure operations are done very lackadaisically, very casually. No one is applying their mind to arrive at a very judicious sort of reason to believe, and to that extent, often in judicial review, search and seizures get struck down on account of reason to believe. One aspect slightly tangential that I'll touch upon, tangential but very, very critical, that I'll touch upon here is, often people ask that, seizure, one understands if it's an illegal seizure, you get it reversed. What happens? What is the impact of an illegal search? Is evidence obtained in an illegal search inadmissible? Unfortunately, in India today, the answer is, it's not inadmissible. The court can look into an evidence obtained through an illegal search, evaluate for its own on its own whether or not it will admit, whether or not it's relevant, etc. It is not per se inadmissible. In US, we have a concept, we have a doctrine called fruit of the poisonous tree, which means that if the tree, that is the search itself, is illegal, poisonous, then the fruit of that tree, the evidence obtained in that illegal search, is also inedible, inadmissible in evidence. It's a very, very well-established principle in US evidence law. Unfortunately, in 1960s and 70s, Indian courts debated whether to adopt this doctrine in India, and specifically rejected this doctrine. But the funny thing is, one of the key cases where Supreme Court rejected it is the case of Puranmal versus Director of Inspection. The reason they rejected it is because and this is specifically noted in the judgment, is because there is no right to privacy in India under the Indian Constitution. Unlike US, where the right to privacy was read into the Constitution much earlier by the courts of law, in 1970s, right to privacy was not recognized under Indian constitutional law. And that was the reason Puranmal cited to specifically reject the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. Now, now that the Supreme Court in a 9-judge decision in the case of Puttaswamy in 2017 has unanimously held that right to privacy is a fundamental right, I foresee a lot of litigations that will happen on the basis of Puttaswamy to overturn Puranmal, to bring in the concept of fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine even in India, such that evidences obtained in an illegal search are made inadmissible, or at least the threshold for the admissibility be made much, much higher than it is today. One of the last things I will talk about is a recent case of the Delhi High Court in the case of RJ Trading. I'll not get into the facts, are fairly detailed, they're there in my slide. But what happened in this case was the Delhi North Commissionerate issued a search authorization, and officers from Noida Commissionerate as well as Ahmedabad Commissionerate, along with the Delhi Commissionerate folks, did a search, did a seizure, and sealed the premises of RJ Traders, who was a cigarette trader. Now, when this went to the High Court tried to examine the reason to believe of the Delhi North Commissionerate. And the only basis for that reason to believe of Delhi North Commissionerate was an email from the Noida authorities, which said that we are conducting a wide investigation of a GST fraud racket. Can you find out if this RJ Trading is a fictitious or a genuine entity? That's it. Noida did not say that this guy is, a GST fraud or conducting a GST fraud. They had a suspicion, and they asked the North Delhi Commissionerate to go and find out, to help them in the investigation. The Delhi High Court said that seeking Noida authorities' request to seek help from the Delhi North Commissionerate cannot be a sufficient reason to believe. That can be reason to suspect. That cannot be reason to believe. There is no investigation against RJT, the cigarette company, the cigarette trading entity, by the CGST North Delhi Commissionerate. They just went by the words of the Noida authority and copy pasted, and even that is not sufficient. Because their Noida authority did not say that there is a fraud going on. They said that we are investigating this. So A, Noida authority does not know. B, I have not carried out any investigation. Yet I have a reason to believe that documents are secreted in his shop, which point out towards the tax evasion. The search and the seizure was held to be unlawful, and order of seizure and sealing was set aside. So this is one of the many cases that I was mentioning where reason to believe was invoked to in favor of the SSE. Now there are very important safeguards that have been laid down by CBSE, right guidelines to be followed during searches through instructions of February this year. Haryana also has issued a circular. Very important to keep multiple printouts of this circular in your office premises so that they are handy whenever a search etc. happens, because more than High Court judgments, some of these internal documents seem to have a little more impact on officers. Not too much of an impact, but a little bit of an impact on GST officers when they are undertaking search and seizure operations. With that, I will hand it over to my colleague and friend Rajiv, who will talk about one of the most important areas of GST and criminal law interface, which is preventive arrests and various types of bail, because ultimately I think that's where the protection lies. If arrests happen, bail is the anticipatory or post-arrest bail are the only remedies that you have. And over to you, Rajiv.
Thank you, Sudipto. Hello, everyone. Let's move on to another critical aspect of our presentation today, which is the investigations under the Act, wherein we will deal with various facets of bail, primarily which are utilized for securing the personal liberties of our officers, colleagues, clients at various stages of an investigation or a trial. But before we deal with the provisions of the GST Act in reference to prosecution or arrest, let's understand what is the concept of bail. Bail is not defined as a term under any law or under the Code of Criminal Procedure. Typically, it means to give surety for an accused. The effect of bail is not to set the accused free, but it is to release an accused from the custody of law and to entrust his custody to a particular surety. Therefore, surety becomes the custodian for a particular accused, and therefore this surety is required to produce the accused during investigation or during trial, or if he is specifically directed by the court. One has to understand the concept of bail is based on an assumption that if a person is accused of a serious crime and is likely to be punished, he or she is considered more prone to either abscond or to obstruct a fair trial, or he may indulge in tampering of evidence or influencing witnesses so as to avoid the prosecution or an ultimate conviction against him. Therefore, while dealing with the bail application, the court's primary concern is that it has to balance the individual liberty of a person who has approached the court, securing his or her personal liberty, versus maintaining the rights of a prosecuting agency and public safety and interest on the other hand. And this is something which is a fine line which the court has to toe. And as Mr. Mittal and Sudipto had indicated, the prosecution under the GST laws has been that the courts have kind of diluted the provisions of bail, where earlier the bail was rule and the jail was exception, but under the GST prosecutions it become a bit draconian, and therefore these provisions become extremely important. In the context of offenses, primarily offenses could be subdivided into two subsets. One is a cognizable offense versus a non-cognizable offense, and two is bailable or a non-bailable offense. One needs to understand these concepts as well. Cognizable offenses are those offenses where an officer can arrest without an arrest warrant and can register an FIR and investigate the offenses without the permission of the court. Vis-a-vis, the non-cognizable offenses are such offenses where in order to investigate the offense, the police officer needs to take a prior permission of the court and requires an arrest warrant. Cognizable and non-cognizable offenses both are defined terms under the Code of Criminal Procedure under Section 2C and Section 2.1 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. The second subcategorization of offenses can be bailable or a non-bailable offense. Bailable or non-bailable offenses under the general statutes is again defined under the first schedule of the Code of Criminal Procedure, Part 1 and Part 2, and or if they are specifically indicated to be so under special law. Primary difference being under these two provisions is that if it's a bailable offense, bail is a matter of right, while if it's a non-bailable offense, bail is at the discretion of the court. In the context of GST, the power of arrest emanates from Section 69, where if a commissioner has reason to believe that an offense has been committed, specified in that section, then he may authorize an officer of central tax to arrest such a person. Now, what are these provisions under the GST? Are primarily governed by Chapter 19 of the GST Act, wherein while various provisions have been provided for which are punishable with fine, but the most draconian section is Section 132, which is then further subdivided into Section 130. We can subcategorize into bailable and non-bailable by saying Section 132 1A to D, wherein if the evasion is more than 5 crores, then all offenses under Section 132 1A to subclause D become non-bailable and cognizable offenses. If the alleged evasion is less than 2 crores, if it is less than 5 crores, then all these offenses are bailable in nature. Let's move on to the next slide as to what is the reason to believe. Reason to believe is kind of an authorization to arrest by the commissioner, which is primarily akin to Section 41A of the Code of Criminal Procedure, which has been introduced recently. In terms of authorization, the latest circulars from the department authorizes every central tax officer, if he has been supported by recorded reasons by the commissioner, to arrest. However, once this arrest happens, what is the kind of protection or the rights which a particular accused can exercise is primarily based on the landmark judgment of D.K. Basu and the circulars issued in the year 2018, which are primarily D.K. Basu case was the case of a custodial death, and therefore the Supreme Court delved into the issue of violation of Article 21 to the extent that what are the kind of protections which a person should enjoy, so that if he has to approach courts or if he is in custody, he should not face harassment. So what are typically these rights which accused may enjoy if he faces a situation where he has to face an arrest? Sudipto, can we move to the next slide, please? So primarily we can subdivide them into these 8 categories. First and foremost being the GST officer should bear an accurate, visible and a clear identification. While they do not have uniforms like a police officer, they must carry identity cards to indicate that they are, the proper officers under the Act and have been backed by reasons to arrest, and therefore they are here to make that arrest. The arresting officer must prepare an arrest memo where these reasons to arrest must be recorded, and this arrest memo must be signed by the arrestee. The accused at that stage has the right to know what are the alleged offenses for which he is being arrested. If the offenses are bailable in nature, the accused has a right to get immediate bail, where he can simply file a bail bond and get bail. A family, friend, or other person nominated by the accused must be informed of the arrest. The accused has a right of medical examination upon arrest and can also specifically seek same. The accused must be presented before a magistrate within 24 hours of his arrest. And if the accused is a female, only a female officer can arrest. Primarily, these rights are as on date or also engrafted under the statutory regime of the CRPC, primarily from section 41A to 41D, and a right to legal remedy and to contact the lawyer is also now a recognized right. Moving on to the offenses for which bail can be granted. Sudipto, can we move to the next slide, please? So in terms of a bail, we need to understand the kinds of bail which one can have the access to. If it's a bailable offense, then the bail is a matter of right, and it is not required as to argue on merits, and primarily a bail bond with an application to say that he has to be given bail is good enough. However, if it is a non-bailable offense, there are 3 kinds of bail one could have an access to. One is a pre-arrest bail, which is popularly known as anticipatory bail. One is a post-arrest bail, which is popularly known as regular bail. And the third kind of bail is post-arrest, where the person has not been granted any kind of bail, but a statutory period post his arrest has expired. Then he is liable to be released, which is primarily or popularly known as default bail. Now let us understand these 3 concepts as well. Pre-arrest bail is primarily governed by section 438 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, where any person who is apprehending an arrest in a non-bailable offense can apply to a session court or a high court having jurisdiction over the offense, alleged offenses, and can seek the bail that in the event he is arrested, he should be released on bail pursuant to certain conditions. And what are those conditions which the courts generally impose are that the accused will make himself available for investigation. He will not tamper with any kind of evidence. He will not induce, threat, or interfere with any witness. These are additionally, they may also impose a condition that he may not leave the country without a specific consent of the court. These are not exhaustive conditions, but these are based on our experience, what we see are the general conditions which the courts impose while granting an anticipatory bail. And this bail has to be filed prior to any possibility of arrest. Based on the latest judgment of Sushila Agarwal, even a registration of case is not important. a mere threat of arrest is good enough to file this bail and seek this remedy before a session court. So therefore, what is the trigger? When should one go to a session court or a high court to seek this bail? There could be various scenarios, but typically if a case has been registered against a particular person and if he is being arraigned as an accused, then if a particular person is being summoned continuously either as an alleged accused or as a witness, but coupled with the fact that he is being threatened with the arrest during those sessions, whether a case is registered or not is immaterial. A summon pursuant to which there is a threat of arrest gives a trigger to filing an anticipatory bail. Where one finds that there are similarly placed co-accused who have either been arrested or who faced a similar situation of being summoned but were being threatened with arrest and have filed an anticipatory bail and have been granted, or where the accused has a reason to believe that the prosecution is primarily being used as a harassment tool. In such a scenario, he may approach the appropriate courts. The second scenario will arise where, pursuant to an allegation of a non-bailable offense and a person is arrested, he may approach the competent magistrate or a sessions court, as the case may be, seeking a regular bail. However, in these cases, as in an anticipatory bail, the bail is at a matter of discretion by the court and is not a matter of right. The concept that bail is a rule and jail is an exception seems to be diluted, at least in cases under the GST Act, as what we are seeing. Conditions similar to grant of anticipatory bail are likely to be imposed. Even much graver conditions could be imposed. It is not necessary that the person needs to be specifically be arrested. He can also surrender before the court and argue that he is in the constructive custody of the court and therefore his regular bail application instead of an anticipatory bail application is maintainable. In the event a first bail application is dismissed, it is no bar to filing of subsequent applications of similar nature. However, there must be some fresh grounds required to be averred in the successive bail applications which were not available at the time when the previous bail applications were disallowed by the court. Until and unless there are fresh grounds, successive bail applications cannot be considered or granted. Conditions imposed by the court can be modified, or bail once granted can also be cancelled by the court based on circumstances or violations committed by the accused for which the prosecution can file an application. Now, under the anticipatory bail and regular bail, there are also subsets of two categories of bail. Under the anticipatory bail, there is also a subset of a transit anticipatory bail, where if assuming the prosecution has been launched in Delhi and one of the accused is a resident in Chennai, and he is facing a threat of arrest, knowing the fact that if he has to approach the Delhi courts, it will take him maybe a couple of weeks, and therefore by that time he will be arrested. He can approach the sessions court in Chennai and seek what is popularly known as a transit anticipatory bail, wherein he would show grounds, one, on merits, and two, that he has to exercise his right to approach the regular sessions court in Delhi, and till that time he should be protected. And in various scenarios we have seen that this transit anticipatory bail is granted by courts, not primarily purely based on merits, but based on the aspect that he will approach the court in Delhi within a designated time. Similarly, there is a subset of a regular bail where, while he may not be released completely on a regular bail, but due to medical reasons or urgent circumstances like bereavement in family or somebody's marriage or some other urgent circumstances which he has to attend, he can be granted a temporary regular bail, which is also a subset of a regular bail in this case. Now, these are the typical scenarios for anticipatory and regular bail, but assuming one has not been able to secure an anticipatory bail or post arrest has not been able to secure a regular bail, then he is in a very grave situation. Either he has to go and appeal against those decisions or he will be in custody, which then takes us to the next category of bail, which is the popularly known as default bail. So, Dipta, can we move on to the next slide? So, what is default bail? Under Section 167 CRPC, it provides that offences punishable for less than 10 years, the accused must be released on bail if the investigation is not completed within 60 days from the date of his arrest. Offences prescribed under the GST, as we all know, the maximum punishment is less than 10 years, and therefore under all offences of GST law, default bail must be granted if investigation is not completed within 60 days from the date of arrest. Therefore, if prior to arrest that has anticipatory is not granted, regular bail is not granted, the person cannot be kept for more than 60 days in custody until and unless a prosecution is actually launched before courts. And this statutory right is without arguing on merits. The moment that 60-day period is over, he can go and approach the court and simply file a bail application alleging that 60 days have expired and therefore he must be granted bail. This right has also been accepted under the GST related offences. The case laws we have kind of mentioned, I don't want to reiterate. However, one must note that in the event this default bail is granted, this does not mean that if a subsequent offense or an unconnected offense is found during the investigation, then this bail will be applicable to the new offenses which have been unearthed during the investigation. And for those offenses, with the permission of the court, the prosecution can again arrest a particular accused. So these are the subsets: bailable bails for bailable offences, bails for non-bailable offences under 3 subsets: anticipatory bail, regular bail, and default bail. So can we move to the next slide, please? Now, from a bird's eye view, what are the parameters that we are seeing generally while grant of bail, whether anticipatory or regular bail under GST? First and foremost, the courts today are, because the manner in which the prosecution alleges the offense, the first aspect that the courts generally are looking at is what is the gravity of the offense, vis-a-vis the role of a particular accused in that. If the offense is of an extremely large amount, the courts tend to sway towards dismissal of a bail, and therefore the gravity of the offense and role of the accused is becoming important while arguing these bail applications. Recently, Punjab Haryana High Court and other high courts have also read into the provisions of GST, the provisions of CRPC with respect to 41A, which primarily prescribes that if an offense is punishable for less than 7 years, the officer who wants to arrest anybody at first needs to issue a notice. And if pursuant to that notice, a particular accused has appeared, he should not be arrested until unless specific reasons are recorded there. And this ground has been recognized by various high courts now. No show cause notice issued for demand under section 73 and 74 prior to making any arrest is another ground which is averred by various applicants, primarily based on make my trip, while it was in the earlier tax regime. But this ground is also being considered by the courts under the GST laws. And this is a matter of debate where, because Supreme Court has kind of taken also a contrary view to say that show cause notice is not a mandatory condition for arrest, and there may be certain scenarios where the prosecution may be bound to arrest because issuance of a show cause notice may take some time, while the accused may abscond in the meantime or tamper with the evidence. While these three areas, are in the favor of the prosecution, there are also views from the courts where, because it is punishable for less than 7 years, the courts are taking a view that these are not extremely serious offenses, coupled with the fact that there is a compounding provision, coupled with the fact that there is an appellate forum where, if a penalty is imposed, can be challenged by way of appeal. Therefore, these are not extremely serious offenses like murder, dacoity. If there is no incriminating evidence or a statement, or there are no criminal antecedents, you are a respectable citizen of the society, you have cooperated with the investigation, where summons were issued and you have duly appeared, but post maybe 3 to 4 appearances, now you are facing heat from the department. These are the circumstances which the courts consider, in addition to merits of the case, to grant a regular or an anticipatory bail. Parity as a legal principle can also be argued by a particular applicant to say that similarly placed co-accused or an applicant who has a much graver role with respect to the alleged offences has been granted bail. Therefore, the particular applicant must also be, based on principles of parity, be granted bail. One can also argue that there is no case for custodial interrogation because the entire evidence is of documentary nature. There is no incriminating evidence which is required to be gathered from a particular applicant, and therefore the question of custodial interrogation does not arise. There is no evidence against a particular accused if the prosecution is being used as a harassment tool. Time spent in custody, and during that time, how fast the investigation has moved, whether it's extremely slow or whether the investigation is at fag end, both scenarios can be argued in a bail. Lastly, courts are also, during anticipatory or regular bail, are sometimes insisting, and they are intelligent enough to not put it as a condition from the court, but by way of an offer by the counsel of an applicant to say that we are ready and willing to deposit a certain amount of the alleged evaded tax for the purposes of bail, is something the courts are also leaning towards, where assuming the entire evaded tax is 100 rupees, an amount of 10 to 20 to 25 rupees will be asked to be deposited by the courts for grant of a bail. So these are, at a bird's eye view, one can consider as primary grounds for filing of a bail application, and if one can tick these boxes, it is likely that he or she may be granted bail. Based on this, I just wanted to put on the table for everybody a recent case that we represented for an anticipatory bail in Patiala House Court in Delhi. And I will put my client as X. Our client X was taking manpower services from a vendor V1, and this vendor V1 was taking further services from its sub-vendor V2. Now, typically, as what happens in the GST regime is that an invoice is issued by V1 upon our client, and therefore our client deposits the amount including the GST with V1 and takes the input tax credit. Similarly, V1 was taking services from V2, and V2 was issuing an invoice, basis which the invoice plus the GST amount was paid to vendor V2. Therefore, the entire amount of GST was in the hands of V2, but V2 failed to deposit that tax. And during that investigation, V2 made a statement that it is a sham entity. Pursuant to an investigation, one of the offices of vendor V1 was found to be non-existent, and therefore because our client X was in the chain of services, summons were received by our client. In those summons, they were alleging that since V2 is a sham entity and V1 was found non-existent on one of the offices, our client, who is one of the biggest e-commerce player in India, is trying to avail input tax credit based on false invoices. At that stage, the client had approached us, wherein we had deposited every kind of data, including a robust compliance system, including all material which showed that services were actually provided by vendor one. And it is typically if vendor one wanted to reduce his tax liability by way of fake invoices from vendor two, our client cannot be held liable. In those circumstances, the grounds that we argued was that there is no allegation of violation of GST laws which can be raised against our client in the facts. We have submitted entire data substantiating that the invoice is pursuant to actually providing of manpower services. We had provided documentary evidence to show that prior to onboarding V1 on our systems, we had done extreme due diligence from a third party, which was recognized by the RBI. There was no show cause notice issued upon our client under section 73 and 74. Even our client was not even in violation of section 16(2)(c), for which we have also filed a writ petition in Delhi High Court, which is pending. DGGI, we showed from its conduct, had actually failed to take timely action, where in the year 2019, allegedly they came to know that V2 was a sham entity and V1 was non-existent. For more than a year, they were sleeping over it and they did not cancel the licenses. And therefore, DGGI was actually not adhering to its statutory duties. We showed our past record, the antecedents of our client, a robust compliance system, and we showed that there were almost 30 summons which our client has attended. And therefore, in these circumstances, our client cannot be arrested under any circumstances whatsoever. While initially the DGGI took a very aggressive stand, but at the time of arguments, DGGI argued that they have only summoned us as witnesses and they do not wish to make an arrest, at which stage we argued that now this stand is not good enough to not grant us any kind of protection, and therefore the court understood the case and directed that in the event the DGGI officers want to arrest anybody from our client's office, then they must issue a prior notice of 7 days, during which period we will be entitled to approach the court and seek an anticipatory bail. So practically our client was protected in these circumstances, but we definitely saw, as Mr. Mittal had indicated, the way this draconian law is being projected before courts in a manner of trivial nature of cases are shown as if they are blown out of proportion just to create that pressure where the department wants to extract the taxes from some member in the supply chain and doesn't wish to kind of go to the actual accused because they may not be traceable. And therefore, it really requires a relook by all courts, especially the Supreme Court and High Courts of India, to see that anticipatory bail provisions are made applicable in a routine manner to GST cases unless there is a repeat offender or there are cases of extremely grave nature where the anticipatory bail should be dismissed. Otherwise, in my view, anticipatory bails must be granted to people who are compliant with law. So that is from my side as a white collar crime lawyer having an overlap with GST cases. And I'll now hand over to Sudipto to kind of conclude with our final submissions on this.
Thanks, Rajiv. That was very exhaustive. I hope it was, sort of give a lot of clues to the audience here. We'll quickly take this, spend another 30 seconds to, just lay down a few key takeaways or best practices that we have learned over the last couple of years dealing with many of these aggressive investigations. I think when we are whether we are internally working in the tax function or finance function of a company, or we are advising, clearly with intensity of aggressive investigations going up, we need to identify or at least put in place very defined processes or protocols for handling summons that are received by employees. We need to have training for non-tax teams, the business or operations teams, because often, especially under GST being a transaction-based tax, if a tax position has been taken on the basis of a particular interpretation or understanding of a transaction, the business or ops guys should also be aligned with that. They should also sing the same song when they are recording their statements. Otherwise, it may create a very different impression. There is a need for training and sensitization of rights and liabilities of the summoned employee. Debriefing, I emphasized on it when I was talking about summons. Very, very critical to have this protocol where debriefing happens immediately after recording of statements under summons, and evaluation happens very quickly vis-a-vis retraction of statements as and when needed. And review of summons from the perspective of challenging in a writ, of course, that's also part of the review. Similarly, protocol for search and seizure. How do we ensure business continuity in case of a search and seizure? Because IT assets can be seized, and if they don't agree to just clone it, if they keep the assets with them, do not return it till the time we go to court and sort of get any remedy, it may be a while, and there may be a business disruption. So we need to plan for some of these business continuity scenarios. And of course, sensitization of trainings, your security teams on your office premises on how to handle searches or tax raids, what are the rights, what are the responsibilities, keeping handy the various departmental manuals and circulars so that they can be referred and pointed out to with the search party when it comes. All of these are very important protocols to be taken care of. And of course, periodic health checks vis-a-vis tax positions, by firms which are not your regular advisors, by an independent firm, to anticipate areas of disagreement with tax authorities. Be prepared with proper documentation in case of summons, search, seizure may be useful. We should be able to anticipate some of the points basis which summons, search or seizure can happen, and be ready with documentation so that we are starting off on a strong footing. We are not taken aback, we are not taken by surprise. And of course, things like review of inter-branch transactions, activities, very regular, because I mentioned at the outset how the triggers for preventive arrest can be tweaked and can be invoked even in the case of even if the substance in cost charges are challenged by the department between multiple branches. Regular due diligence of the entire vendor ecosystem. The case study that Rajiv mentioned at length effectively emanates from that due diligence. Because of thorough due diligence was undertaken, we were able to obtain pre-arrest protection for the client. So regular due diligence of the entire vendor ecosystem, supplier ecosystem, including physical visits from time to time to ascertain genuineness, to ascertain that yes, they continue to exist and operate from the place that they have declared, is very critical. And at times maybe seeking right of compliance audits in extreme cases. So all of these, I think, are takeaways which we have gathered over handling multiple investigations, and maybe some of these, if not all, can be considered by you for your client, for your company. With that, we'll pause here and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, sir, for your presentation. So there are a few questions in the question answer box as well as in the box. So would request you to take it.
Okay, let me just. So one of the questions is, and this is something I had touched upon, if the copy of the statement is shared along with the show cause notice only, and you realize it contains some statements which may not be correct, what is the remedy? Since a copy was not shared with the SSE, can you say that the timelines of retraction should start from the receipt of formal statements? This would happen so many times in case of non-tax persons being summoned due to their unfamiliarity with tax, and they may not recall the things more clearly. Summons is a more I think this is precisely what I was trying to hint at, and this is why I mentioned the importance of having a protocol in place in terms of debriefing. Yes, we must have a copy of the recorded statement. But we also know practically that is not forthcoming from the department. We can go to court and try to implement that, but so one is that process. But if we are at a drawing board, if we have the luxury to prepare, I guess we should prepare in terms of being ready with debriefing and being ready with retractions before the show cause notice stage. Because the moment the show cause notice comes along with the relied upon documents in the form of the statements, at that stage, if we retract, often that gets taken as an afterthought. That gets taken not as a genuine retraction, but more like a afterthought to sort of wriggle out of a particular show cause notice. So even then one can argue that I was not served a copy, but then one has to establish that I kept asking for the copy of this, I tried to meet, etc. You have to establish a long line of things in order to successfully retract at the stage of if you have not retracted prior to the stage of show cause notice. Rajiv, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this.
No, that's good enough, I think.
I think some people have requested for the deck to be emailed. The deck is with ASSOCHAM and they will, I guess, email that. How a consumer will complain if proprietor of a shop is not giving bill which have GST number on it. Now, I mean, that depends on whether the shop is liable for registration or not. If it is liable and if it is not issuing a bill, there are multiple sort of problems with that. There are other consumer laws, there are GST laws, both of which get triggered. One can file a complaint and bring this to the notice of tax authorities. Various state tax authorities have helpline numbers for these kind of things, so one can do that. But I mean, on the lighter side, this is more to defend people rather than to, the idea of the session was to help people have arguments to defend against any such complaint. So I will not go too much into detail on this. I think, is there any question in the Q&A box, Avinash? Because I think in the chat, I could only find these ones.
Yes, sir, there are questions in the Q&A box. Yeah, in the question box, there are questions.
Okay, let me just find it.
Because, sir, can you read it, sir?
In service tax regime, I'm reading from the Q&A. Service tax regime, a judgment was issued in the case of 20th Century Fox, wherein the importance of bona fide belief was highlighted. In a scenario wherein an assessee is under a bona fide belief basis the opinion obtained from a CA lawyer, what is the probability of it sailing through the time of inspection, search, seizure on taxability of a transaction, availment of ITC? In my experience, and of course, there can be a wide range of answers to this. In my experience, opinion may not help at the time of a search seizure operation. Opinion demonstrates that you have done your due diligence, that you have not arrived at a particular tax position without consulting experts, etc. So it establishes your bona fide, undoubtedly. But that bona fide comes into play when the hearing on merits is happening, when the court is actually hearing on the issue of penalty, on the issue of whether preventive arrest, etc. Will be, need to be invoked or not at the outset. So at the time of search, if you show that does not necessarily, that doesn't mean they will stop. You cannot ask that, I have taken an opinion on this position, so you should stop your search. That's not how it's going to work. You can at best establish your bona fide, and practically it will help you when the matter goes to court, not before that.
Just one more point I wanted to add here. It may help to dispel the presumption under section 135 of the GST Act, which presumes a guilty mind, where one could argue if a case or an investigation is launched that my intent was not to evade the tax, because the intention to evade the tax under section 132 is primary. An act could be a bona fide on an inadvertent act, and therefore I think that presumption is a rebuttable presumption, where your opinions or your due diligence, where you thought with all good intent that a particular item is not taxable. I think that could be one area where you can utilize such opinions.
Correct. I think one question. Yes, sir.
I would like to add here point, which we are missing here, which I believe certainly all professionals should think. The search under GST, central excise and service tax can never be conducted on the belief of evasion of tax, particularly in the GST law. If you read section 67(2), the search is very, very limited scope. It is section just of 4 lines. The search warrant INS 01, if you see, it is very, very clear. I have a reason to believe you have secreted certain records which are necessary for the proceeding under the GST law. For the second reason, if they have reason to believe the goods are liable to be confiscated. Therefore, to say that there is a evasion, no evasion, there is no such power under the law. And Supreme Court has time and again said the criminal law or the taxation law has to be interpreted or construed strictly. Therefore, how this, though I know it is happening across the board, but this point is totally missing. I never see any arguments on the ground that, in fact, we are leading one case in the Gujarat High Court. And after, some amount it was heard because of the April, COVID, it went into the Thanda Basta, and now how will come, where the allegation was that if the person has not filed the GST return for 3 months. And they even went to say that their ship, which was on the sea, they almost seized it. They said, we will not allow them to come on the port. As an interim measure, which was granted instantly by the court, we filed the petition. It was heard within a couple of hours. The court said, I will charge it from the commissioner pocket, 8 lakhs rupees per month, which they are going to pay, or you release the ship. They release the ship within 1 minute. The second question which is going on, I did not file the return and I could not file. Can it be a ground for the search as per section 67(2)? Either you say section 67(2) is a search can be conducted any time by any officer on his whims and fancies. I will not come on the way. The parliament has not given such power. Therefore, we cannot, presume the power in the guise of that there is a tax evasion. In fact, मैं तो ये आर्गू करता रहा हूं पिछले 20 साल में, मेरे घर के बाहर परमानेंट बोर्ड लगा, मैं सबसे बड़ा टैक्स इवेडर हूं, कोई आता ही नहीं सर्च करने. तो क्या ये पावर है क्या? ये सबसे बड़ी बात ये है कि पावर है क्या? Yes, your view, please.
So in fact, I have heard this view. In fact, I have had the chance to discuss also with you. So, I mean, just for the larger audience. So, what sir is saying is flowing from the, the wording of section 67, which says that when can search be triggered? One is, of course, goods liable for confiscation. And second is documents, things, etc., which are secreted in any place, which are relevant for any proceeding. So the specific words evasion of tax or short payment, etc., is not mentioned. So I'm not 100% confident of that, which is why I have not taken, because proceedings has a very wide connotation. So if there is a proceeding going on, if there is an inquiry going on, and they believe an inquiry is for evasion or inquiry is for excess availment of credit, कुछ भी हो सकता है. Shouldn't we read proceedings, because it is so wide, to include evasion also? Because evasion is only one aspect. If there is a proceeding, proceeding would capture all sorts of scenarios, wouldn't it?
I have a different view, though my final hearing is to take place another important batch matter on 29. But recently just I got the message that the new Chief Justice have been appointed in various High Court. I do not know whether now hearing will take place or not, because the entire board will get changed. But the question is that we always, speak, in the manner which the Supreme Court teaches us through the various judgments. The Parliament at their own wisdom has drafted the law, and the officer has no power to expand the scope of that. If you compare with the other laws, like Income Tax Act, you can read section 132. It goes and goes on X, Y, Z, n number of reasons. Therefore, the Parliament could have put X number of reason here. Why so much of small section? And the another reason is that, in fact, if with my experience I'm speaking, and yet to see the light of the day in many other cases also, which I'm arguing, that under which law they have the power to make an inquiry. First they tell us. We can't presume. The inquiry has to be under a law. You can't work because the law has undergone significant change. Earlier, all power was in the department. Now it is a self-assessment. Therefore, it is presumed that every assessee is honest. And that's why you rightly said in your presentation also, okay, there are some material is required to make such belief and to, give an authorization for the search. Therefore, authorization of the search is not inquiry. Inquiry is something else. Search is different. The inquiry, if you see, which I can say on record, these officers, what I have seen, the superintendent and inspector is the biggest officer in the department. Commissioner and chief commissioner are only a puppet of these officers. I say on record of these facts. Can you ever see any commissioner made an inquiry? Every time a superintendent you face in any law, whether it is the custom, whether in excise and GST, service tax. And in fact, in GST law, I'm going in details, and other so many cases are pending and lined up. Who is these officers? Are they appointed under the law? Do they have any power under any provision? Read any provisions. Therefore, neither they are officers, nor they are appointed by the central government or the GST law, nor they have been given any power under the statute to make an inquiry. Now, coming under the power, what is inquiry and investigation? These two words has not been defined. Why these are not undefined? Which I believe, surely I believe, not as a SOCHM co-chairman, as an individual advocate, that these are the corrupt officers. They don't want to define because no law could leave it. They said, if I make an inquiry, I believe Sidupto should come to me. It is an inquiry. It is not an inquiry. Inquiry comes the power under the substantive law. Therefore, where is the substantive law to make an inquiry? He has to tell us. Therefore, they argue that the section 67 is the power of making an inquiry. Therefore, the question arises, 67 come later on. Before that, you have to authorize them. If you read the Gujarat High Court decision, the search immediately ends as soon as the Panchnama is drawn. Therefore, if that is an inquiry that ends there, thereafter, who will make an inquiry under which provision? I think so. Somewhere down the line, one has to discuss about this also.
There is one question, Rajiv, I think you will have to answer. When there is no provision of anticipatory bail as in Uttar Pradesh, does that mean that accused will be arrested and only then he can apply for a bail?
I think Uttar Pradesh has now introduced anticipatory bail, but wherever the anticipatory bail provisions are not applicable, it is, various other statutes like Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribes Act, there is a bar for anticipatory bail. And if a particular state has barred that provision of law to be applicable for that state, then anticipatory bails cannot be filed therein. Possibly in Uttar Pradesh, what we used to do was we used to go in a writ jurisdiction, challenge the summons or challenge the proceedings, and by way of that, at least at a pre-arrest stage, we used to seek no coercive action. But yes, once post-arrest stage, a regular bail is applicable in every state, and therefore, to that extent, you can go for a regular bail only post-arrest. Then that writ will not be maintainable, even assuming you go in a habeas corpus writ where you allege that the arrest was illegal. The courts tend to, not entertain habeas corpus petition based on certain judicial pronouncements.
And one more question, Rajiv, for you. can a person who is arrested under GST attend a pending civil litigation under other law? Would bail be required or direct hearing can happen?
So in scenario like this, one would suggest that somebody who's in custody in a civil case, until unless he is specifically summoned as a witness or specifically summoned to appear by the court, a temporary regular bail will not be granted. Yes, definitely, if he's scheduled to appear as a witness before a particular court, at that stage he can show that he has to appear basis some order of the civil court and seek an interim regular bail basis that.
I think one last question we will take. What is to be done in the case of cross charges, because industry is not following the Columbia Asia judgment? It means companies are not charging the salary cost. See, I think two things. In the context that I mentioned, cross charge, and where lack of substance in a cross charge service invoice, the department can invoke the preventive arrest provisions. There, the very substance of the transaction might has been questioned. The department is questioning: is there a service at all, or does the location from where the service is claimed to have been provided, does it have the resources, etc., to do that? That was the context where I was coming from. Whether or not Columbia Asia is to be followed is a valuation issue. Yes, I think most of the industry has taken a view that employee salary cost is not something that can form part of a consideration under GST, and to that extent it is not to be charged. I tend to agree with that view, but of course the issue is now pending before Karnataka High Court, so we'll see where where that goes. I don't think so. Again, because it is sub judice, I don't think I should comment any further. Mittal sir, if you want to say something on this.
Cross charge issue, I believe there could be different things. I have my view, which we discussed before pandemic in SHM meeting also. Industry themselves are asking there should be some kind of clarity on this issue. My personal view is that where is the law saying there would be tax on that? Where is the law? Because the supply of goods and services are totally different. Because if you read the Phillips judgment long back of the Supreme Court, where they said the revenue authority will do greater, justice in the law if they respect the actual business practices. So suppose today I have 6 offices. In fact, you people will face a problem like this, those who are professionals. They have the multi places, the offices. And one go to the around, all these offices. Can it be necessary to have such kind of things? You have a group of, companies, and the one person, attribute his function to all the companies. Where is, the activity taking place for these? So the survey, I have a very different view on that. Service is totally different than, asking someone to allocate the expenditures. So we have to make, and this view has, right from the 2003 first time a question was asked in SHM conference, I strictly remember. I am following it. And if you can remember, in the service tax regime, every case has been decided in favor of the assessee with the secondment, etc. All these things has come. So time will come, probably we will get justice in these type of cases also. I have not heard any cases booked by any officer on this ground, though maybe advanced ruling authority, etc. some has given some.
So I saw this in the couple of audits and investigations where they're using some of these grounds to threaten arrest and stuff like that, as they usually do, not an advanced ruling.
Definitely, the arrest is totally different. My friend Mr. Bhatnagar has dwelled upon it. The arrest is not for the purpose of that you are not paying tax as per my wishes. If the income tax will follow this procedure, everybody will be behind the bar. Everybody. Because the tax dispute is totally different than to say that the arrest will be made. Arrest is a limited ground, particularly in the GST law, you see, if there is a no supply, if the tax collected not paid, if merely a tax dispute, no even power is given to arrest.
So what is happening? I was trying to explain that at the beginning of my slide, where this is being invoked. They are saying that if I have said I have cross-charged X amount from Delhi to Bombay, tax authorities are saying that how have you cross-charged? You are saying you have provided support services. what exactly is the support service you have provided? And if you are unable to satisfy them, they are saying this is provision of service or raising of invoice without provision of service. And hence section 69 read with 132 is getting triggered, and hence we will. So, ये सब हो रहा है. So that was the context.
The Indian officers' mind, that's why everywhere is saying, on the record or off the record, the people of industry are saying the government officers are killing the industries. You are advising to your company. Can you advise to do it illegally? If I'm advising my company, can I do so? All these big company, they are, they are targeting. If you will target like this, when anybody will run the business activity in this country. That's why this power of arrest, ASSOCHAM president, when Anil Agarwal was there, and thereafter even as a past, he always said that there should not be a power of arrest, because he knows it. In the grab of this power, they kill the business activity, and superintendent does it. If you go to the ministry, etc., हम क्या कर सकते हैं? अब कितने चार्टर्ड अकाउंटेंट अरेस्ट कर लिए हैं? हो सकता है एक दो इंडल्ज रहा होगा. 90 आपने you would have read the judgment of Punjab Haryana High Court. They said advocate and chartered accountant who merely does consultancy, and they cannot be arrested. You should avoid arrest of those professionals. And you read the certain judgment under the Chartered Accountant Act of the Supreme Court even. They said the professionals cannot reveal professional under under the Chartered Accountant Act as well as the Indian Evidence Act. You cannot ask a professional during the course of engagement whatever information he has collected, because there is a total bar. Who will teach all these officers? Therefore, we as a officer of the court must take this stand very clearly, so that the court one day will appreciate that these arrests are not on the fancy ground which these officers are alleging. If one question we are able to get in the RTI कि कितने लोगों को अरेस्ट किया, कितने लोगों की कंप्लेंट फाइनली आज की, उसी डाटा से पिक्चर क्लियर हो जाएगी. आप जस्टिस चंद्रचूड़ के वर्ड्स देखिए ना, उसमें भी फेक बिलिंग का ही केस था. आप ध्यान रखना, जो उन्होंने ऑब्जर्वेशन दिया जिसमें उन्होंने बैंक अकाउंट अटैच किए थे. डिस्पाइट द एलिगेशन ऑफ फेक बिलिंग, दिस केस वाज डिसाइडेड अगेंस्ट द रेवेन्यू.
I think we have answered all the questions.
There's one in the Q&A section. There is one very interesting question in the Q&A section. What is preventive arrest? Which statute gives the evolution of this term? So, to my limited understanding, preventive arrest under GST, the only provision of arrest is 69, which is not in the nature of a preventive arrest. It is where there are reasons to believe that somebody has committed an offense under section 132, specifically 1A to D. And therefore, the concept of preventive arrest is not part of GST to my limited understanding, because reasons to believe under various statutes has been said to be not just a suspicion, but there has to be material which gives reason to believe that offense has been committed. As far as preventive arrest is concerned, there are various other statutes like OFEPOSA, NSA, where preventive arrest is made based on national security and other charges. Under CRPC as well, there is a provision for amenable to, similar to a preventive arrest, where a police officer, if he has found that there is a design to commit a cognizable offense, and there is no other option but to arrest to prevent that commission of cognizable offense, he can arrest. But under the GST, there is no such provision. And because section 4 and 5 of the CRPC says that unless there is a conflict or there is a different provision in the special law that will prevail, under GST, because they have not read the provision, I think it's 151 of the CRPC, they have not read that into the powers of arrest generally. I don't see, and this is my limited understanding and view, that preventive arrest as a concept cannot be invoked under GST, like what is possible for a police officer.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Rajiv. I think I would have used the word somewhere in a very casual way, because what happens is under 69, you don't need to complete an assessment to invoke the arrest. So in
I
that
think
context,
our presentation also in the last section uses preventive arrest. I think
Yeah.
the connotation is not, I think preventive arrest is used from a terminology of an anticipatory bail, that where you prevent that arrest.
so it is not, so preventive arrest has a very specific constitutional, and as Rajiv said, that sort of a context when you are doing, you have this Gunda Act, and in multiple states, it is that to prevent public order or to preserve public order, you do a preventive arrest. Here we are, we have used the word very loosely because you can arrest under GST without completion of assessment. I think, Avinash, we can close the session for the day. I think we have answered most of it, and we are
Yes,
way
sir.
over time
Yes, sir.
also.
Thank you, sir. So, sir, let me propose a hearty vote of thanks to our experts, Mr. Sudipta Bhattacharya, Mr. Rajiv Bhatnagar from Ketan & Company, and Mr. J.K. Mittal, our co-chairman of Indirect Tax Council, for sharing their views with the participants. I would also like to thank all the participants for attending this session, and shall be sharing the presentation with you in a day or two. So we look forward to have you with us in our forthcoming seminars that we shall be having at least one knowledge series on indirect taxes every month, and we look forward to have you in the next session. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.